Good afternoon. Thanks for coming along. You know, just let me say I feel very privileged to be asked to give a talk in this series after having only been at the lab for a year. I am settling in very well, though. I'm making great progress on learning the acronyms. I'm up to the D's already, so I feel that very soon I will understand what's being said, so thank you. You know, I was listening to one of these motivational speakers being interviewed on television a couple of weeks ago, and he came up with a rather interesting statistic. Now, of course, you have to bear in mind that 81% of all statistics are made up on the spot. But and I would imagine with motivational speakers you have to add a good 10 points to that. But here's what he said. He said that each of us every day has about 60,000 thoughts, of which 40% involve prediction in some way. Well, you know, whether you believe that statistic, and of course, you know, why should you? It's certainly the case that a large part of our mental faculties are dedicated to prediction in one form or another. Some of it is under the rubric of science, but not all of it, obviously. And maybe the argument can be made that what distinguishes truly sort of scientific prediction from mere prophecy or divination is a systematic account and conveyance of the uncertainties associated with it. And that's my topic, how we go about doing uncertainty analysis, historically and today. By the way, before we move on, I want to challenge everyone. If anyone can name these 4 dead white European males, there's an extra cookie out in the lobby. Are there any takers right now? Just one, then. Bayes, yeah, we have Bayes. Heisenberg. No, not Schrödinger. Bayes, Heisenberg. The first one's Nostradamus. And the third one is Laplace. I knew the cookie would be safe with Laplace. I didn't realize you wouldn't get Nostradamus, though. I think there are some very exciting things going on right now at PNNL in terms of predictive sciences. And of course, where there's prediction, there's uncertainty. And I'm going to be talking about some of those programs later. But first of all, let's just talk a little bit about what prediction is. I think most of us in the sciences have a pretty firm idea of what we mean by prediction, what's meaningful prediction. And it was Laplace, I think, who first kind of crystallized this idea. He said, as a scholar, I must provide you with works permitting predictions. In other words, we're all really in the prediction business as scientists. I think that other philosophers followed on from Laplace, kind of expanded on this theme. Karl Popper obviously comes to mind, and he said that something can only really be considered a scientific theory if its predictions are in some way falsifiable, at least in principle. So falsifiability, prediction, science, they all kind of go hand in hand, and that's the business most of us tend to be in. Well, on something of a roll, Laplace upped the ante with this proposition. I'll read it with you. It says, an intellect which at a certain moment would know all forces that set nature in motion and all positions of all items of which nature is composed, for such an intellect, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes. Obviously a little flowery language, you know, especially, say, for a DOE report, but what he meant by that was this, and I think it's a concept we're all familiar with. If we know the initial conditions for some dynamical system, and we know the equations that govern the evolution of the system, then in principle, we can make these perfect predictions about the way the system is going to unfold in future. And the better we are at science, the more accurately we make those predictions until, in the end, perfect predictability, or at least that's the pipe dream. However, what Laplace had not predicted, for all his cleverness, was quantum theory. In the 1920s, a very unsettling aspect of the physical world became apparent. It seems there's this very fundamental and irreducible uncertainty that's kind of woven into the very fabric of the physical world. It's a type of uncertainty that no amount of clever science can eliminate. It's very fundamental. It's a bottom line type uncertainty. So, in a sense, Laplace's pipe dream was shattered because of that. It's not practical, in fact, to make perfect predictions about the world. Of course, it didn't take quantum theory for those of us in the sciences to be continually confronted by uncertainties. In a sense, eroding uncertainties is the business we're in. However, some decisions have to be taken today. Can't wait for us to do our scientific work, and therefore we need to be able to convey today's uncertainties in a kind of systematic and rational way. And that's what uncertainty analysis is about. Now, of course, prediction's been around, or prediction professionals have been around a lot longer than uncertainty analysts. Perhaps one of the more famous ones was another Frenchman, an earlier era, Nostradamus. He would make these predictions in a poetic form, in the form of quatrains. One of his more famous ones is this one. He predicted some German fellow with the name of Hister would create all kinds of havoc in Europe, and of course, any thinking person would associate Hister with Hitler. But of course, you'll notice here no hint of an uncertainty analysis, but just imagine there had been. Just thinking what higher esteem we might have held Nostradamus if he'd only thought to do some kind of uncertainty analysis. But on the other hand, he didn't. So for that reason, I think few of us tend to think of Nostradamus as the forefather of predictive analytics. Well, how do we do uncertainty analysis? I think for most of us, our first exposure to uncertainty analysis is in the form of classical statistics. And it's still a very useful method. Perhaps not so much in the classical physical sciences, where systems tend to be highly coupled and deterministic, but more, say, in the medical sciences or the sociological sciences, where there is an element of what we call aleatory uncertainty associated with the processes, a kind of randomness, a coin-tossing type of randomness associated with the system. And the way classical statistics usually works is we start with something we call the null proposition, which is some proposition we want, or the null hypothesis. It's something we want to disprove. So, for instance, in pharmaceutical trials, the null hypothesis might be that the mean response of the placebo group is exactly equal to the mean response of the group that was treated by the drug. We then take the pharmaceutical trial data and we show that the probability of having obtained that data, if the null hypothesis were true, is very low, hopefully. And that gives us a sense of confidence, therefore the null hypothesis must be false. Right? So that's the mode of application of classical statistics. Well, that's all well and good in this type of application, but it's got kind of limited usefulness. First of all, it really comes at the problem completely backwards. It asks what's the probability of having gotten the data given the hypothesis. Now, in many other kind of real-world problems, we're interested in the opposite of that. We're interested in what's the probability a given proposition is true given the data. It's a kind of back-to-front probability that classical statistics comes up with. And for reasons I won't go in with, because it's got that back-to-front nature, it's devilishly difficult to deal with in a model of any complexity. So it's a very limited use, compounded by the fact that often you don't have the nice little statistical models you do, say in pharmaceutical medical trials, to produce these back-to-front probabilities. So classical statistics, it's all well and good, but it's of limited applicability. For this reason and others, in the 1920s to the 1950s, there's this huge change in the way we viewed probabilities. Something called Bayesianism emerged. That was one of the guys that someone identified, in fact. The most important thing about Bayesianism versus classic type probabilities is that, in a sense, the arguments are reversed. It allows us to calculate the probability of the proposition given the data. Okay, and that's what we're usually interested in, right? We want to know what's the probability there's going to be a major accident in this nuclear power plant given the data. Or what's the probability there's going to be a terrorist attack against this target given the data? Or the probability of an avian flu outbreak given the data. That's what we're often really interested in many practical real-world problems. So if you can pull this off, it's going to be a very useful thing. And by being able to write the probability of a proposition given the data, we can address uncertainties that are not of an aleatory nature, not of a coin-tossing type nature, but a general class of propositions. So, for instance, we might say, what's the probability that the neutrino particle is truly massless? Okay, I mean, it's a debate that's been resolved, but there was always a question of, Does a neutrino have a literally zero mass or some small but finite mass? Well, it's not that some fraction of them have mass and some don't, and we can use that fraction as a kind of probability. They either all do or they all don't. So what Bayesianism did, it kind of divorced the idea of probability just from frequencies, coin-tossing type notions of what probability is, so-called epistemic probabilities. Well, what is a probability in that case if it's not related to a frequency of some sort? Well, what the Bayesians tell us is that a probability is a measure of partial belief in the truth of some uncertain proposition. So when I tell you there's a 20% probability that something's true, I'm saying on a scale of 0 to 100, my degree of belief, my level of belief is a kind of 20 on the belief gauge. Well, that sounds horribly woolly, doesn't it? I mean, in a scientific setting, that doesn't sound like the sort of thing we can work with. How do we produce them? Well, there's Bayes' theorem. By the way, this is called Bayesianism, even though Thomas Bayes, the guy for who its name actually died a couple of centuries before anyone had heard of Bayesianism. He knew nothing of this. The reason his name posthumously got attached to it is that there was a theorem he proved, a theorem of probability theory, that actually turns out to be a very useful way of producing Bayesian probabilities. De Finetti, one of the founders of Bayesianism, famously said that probabilities don't exist. Which seems like a curious statement, but what he means by that is it's not a frequency out there that we're trying to estimate. It's really the conception of the analyst. It's a degree of belief. So that brings us back to the question, what does that mean? What's the degree of belief? So now the frequentists seem to get supplanted by the Bayesians, the kind of people who conceive degrees of belief out of their own mind powers. By the way, I don't mean to imply from this that Bayesians are generally naked. That's not true. Only 31% I hear of Bayesians are naked at any one time. And none of you showed up today, so that's good. So what is a degree of belief? I mean, that doesn't mean a whole lot to most of us. Well, De Finetti suggested a type of framework in which we could think about what a degree of belief is. And let me take you through his thought process with a simple example. We're going to bet on whether the Bombers are going to win on Friday. You and I are going to play Bucky and Gambler. And the way it's going to work is that the gambler is going to put up a stake of X dollars. If the Bombers win, the Bucky has to pay out $100 to the guy. If the Bombers lose, then he loses his stake. And I'm going to, as I say, we're going to play Bucky and Gambler. We're going to have that bet, and I'm going to ask you what you think a fair stake is for that bet. But here's the twist. I'm not going to tell you which one of us is going to be Bucky and which one's going to be Gambler till after you've offered up your stake number, your value. So the concept is that you will come up with a number that will minimize your expected losses given that you don't know which way I'm going to choose in terms of Bucky and Gambler. And that stake then is a surrogate for, it's a representation of your implied probability that the Bombers are going to win. So, for instance, if your stake was $20, if that's what you said would be a fair bet, I would infer from that you assess the probability of the Bombers winning at 20%. Now, don't miss an interesting point about this, that the probability here is based in the notion of personal risk. Often we think of it exactly the opposite way round. We think of risk as something that's composed of probabilities and consequences, whereas probability itself really doesn't have much meaning in the Bayesian setting without the context of risk, which I think is an interesting point. I'm going to show you an example later of application of this where that type of interpretation becomes very relevant. So this is what probabilities can be construed as in the Bayesian worldview. And from those very sort of humble conceptual beginnings have arisen studies of enormous complexity based on Bayesian probability theory. One of them, which I may still hold the record in terms of sheer size of the study, was one I was involved in. I was one of the project managers in this. It was the Nuremberg 1150 study done by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It was quite a few years ago now. It was completed around about 1990. And it was a probabilistic risk assessment of 5 nuclear power plants using a kind of state-of-the-art, or developing state-of-the-art methods. It involved thousands of input variables. They range from system, equipment reliability parameters, human reliability parameters, models of the phenomenology of core melt, of aerosol dispersion, structural mechanics, seismic models. It was just a huge model. Several hundred experts were elicited in terms of input probabilities for this. And it was all brought together under the rubric of Bayesian probability analysis, this whole betting on the bombers type concept. Just to give you a feel for what the interpretation is, let's just look at that top line, the so-called 95th percentile. What this point here tells you is that there is a 95% probability that the frequency with which there'll be an accident involving 10 or more fatalities is 1 in a million years or less. And then the lower lines pertain to other percentiles. So that is, that's the top of the line Bayesian analysis that includes an enormous amount of input information. And yet, notwithstanding the scale and scope of these applications and the resources that have been put into Bayesian studies, there are still some very fundamental questions about whether Bayesianism is truly a good model of uncertainty and the way that we conceive beliefs. There are some concerns about this. And let me try and explain what they are, kind of in a nutshell. I think they are put in sharpest relief in the question of how do you go about expressing complete ignorance. Say you've got a string of propositions. Only one of them is true, all the others are false. You're completely ignorant as to which the one is that's true. And I say to you, how do you attach, therefore, probabilities to each of those? The probability that each is true. Well, on this, Laplace has something to say. It's his so-called principle of indifference. He said you'd attach an equal probability to each one. And that kind of intuitively makes sense. 50-50 on a toss of a coin, for instance. Well, it might seem intuitively obvious, but there's still some ambiguity associated with that. Think of the continuous space limit of that situation. Say you've got a continuous parameter space, and you know your parameter has some value in that range, but you don't know where it is. You're completely ignorant. How would you represent that in terms of a probability distribution over that parameter space? Well, you might say that's obvious. You put a flat distribution, a uniform distribution. But that's an ambiguous proposition. Let me give you an example. In fact, it was in that Nurgle M50 study that we confronted this one. There's a phenomenon called high-pressure melt ejection. This is where there's been core damage. The nuclear reactor core has melted. The bottom head of the reactor's failed. And then the question is, could you get a high-pressure ejection of the molten core high enough that it could pressurize the containment building and even challenge the integrity of the containment structure? That's high-pressure melt ejection. And the problem we had to face in our modeling context was on what fraction of core melt scenarios would you get this high-pressure melt ejection that would challenge the containment? So that fraction was the uncertain parameter. Well, if I express that question, well, should it be 20%, 50%, 70% of the time? You might be inclined from that to say, well, let's just put a uniform distribution over it. That kind of makes sense. But say I'd re-express that. Say I'd said, well, will it happen 1 in 10 times, 1 in 100 times, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 1,000,000 times? Well, suddenly that's got a kind of logarithmic feel to it, doesn't it, in terms of what that means in terms of uncertainty. People who do reliability analysis are used to dealing with logarithmic scales. So I could put a uniform distribution over the logarithm, i.e. a log uniform distribution, which kind of might look like that second one. Well, those are not the same thing. And because there's no natural parameterization of the problem, there's no obvious choice between the two. And the problem is, when you put those into the model, they have different implications for the output. When you think about it, it's a truly transcendent form of ignorance in which you don't even know how best to be ignorant. But that was exactly the situation we're in this one. So, how do you address that problem? What can you do to resolve it? Well, suggestions have been made. Some of them so radical as to say maybe Bayesianism, maybe probability theory even, is not the best way to express uncertainties and partial beliefs. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about alternatives that have been suggested to probabilistic approaches to doing this. Okay, this is a current issue. It will shortly be a current issue. The presidential run for '08. And the question we want to address is, who do you think is going to win? And I picked 4 names. Should be no similarity to real people. I picked these names at random from the Richland phone book. What were the odds? Now, say that say like me, you really don't have a strong feel for who's going to win. I mean, I'm not talking about preferences, but actually a prediction. You've no idea who the winner might be. Well, if probabilities, as the Bayesians claim, are measures of partial belief, then surely we'd want to attach low probabilities to reflect a low partial belief in any one of those candidates, 0.1 say. So I could attach 0.1 to each of them. Well, as you know, I can't do that because probabilities have to normalize. If this were the sea of candidates, and let's assume, I know it's not the reality of it, but let's assume they were the only candidates, those probabilities would have to add to 1. It's a question of normalization. Well, let's say we looked at it now not in a probabilistic setting, but in another framework, and this is called Dempster-Shafer theory of evidence. This is something that was introduced in the 70s, Arthur Shafer and Glenn Shafer, Arthur Dempster. And they came up with this actually quite independently, but it really is the one and the same methodology. I want you to just look at the middle column now. In Dempster-Shafer theory, you don't have probabilities, you have something called a probability mass. It's like a probability in the sense that once you've assigned them all, they have to normalize to 1. But here's the big difference. You don't have to assign probability masses to individual candidates. You can assign probability masses to any subset of candidates. So let me show you what I mean. Say that you have some degree of belief, albeit not strong, and I'm not going to talk about where the evidence comes from, but I'm presuming that these were the appropriate degrees of belief based on the evidence. Say you've got some small degree of belief that it's going to be a Democrat, 0.2 say. So I would attach a 0.2 to the subset that correspond to the Democrats. Say I also have some rather weak degree of belief that the winner will be a male, not representing my personal view, but I just wanted to think of an example of a subset, okay? Let's say it's a 0.3, so we attach a 0.3 probability mass to the subset that are males. Now, in Dempster-Shafer, I'm under absolutely no obligation to attach probability masses to individual candidates. On the other hand, there's nothing to stop me doing that if I think there's evidence that points towards one of them, some kind of evidence. So let's say there is that kind of evidence, albeit very weak, and let's say it points towards the candidate Obama, right? So a 0.1 there. Now, here's the single most significant difference between probability theory and Dempster-Shafer theory. I can now take my balance of probability mass, i.e. 0.4, and I can attach it to the proposition of complete ignorance. In other words, I can attach it to the entire set of candidates. It's ignorance because all I'm saying there is that I have a degree of belief that one of them will win, right? And that's one of those, what you call a DER situation. There's no additional information there. So that's 0.4 dedicated to ignorance. Well, given that you've now distributed these probability masses, what in the end can you say about the individual candidates in terms of belief? Well, what happens in Dempster-Shafer theory now is that belief bifurcates into 2 measures. There is the support and the plausibility. So let me go through what they mean. Let's pick one of the candidates. Let's take Hillary, for example. The support for Hillary is equal to the degree to which I believe the evidence points towards Hillary winning. The plausibility for Hillary is the degree to which the evidence fails to point towards one of the other candidates winning. Now, in Dempster-Shafer, in probability theory, those 2 things are one and the same. Whereas in Dempster-Shafer theory, they're distinctive things. There is that extra degree of freedom introduced. Those, by the way, these supports and plausibilities are calculated from the probability masses. Just to state quickly how that's done, the support for a given set is equal to the sum of the probability masses attached to all the sets it contains, whereas the plausibility is the sum of the probability masses associated with all the sets with which it intersects. So it's a very straightforward way of coming out with these supports and plausibilities. Well, one thing you'll notice as you look down the list there of the support attributions is that they're not normalized, right? If you add those up, they come to 0.1, which is, any seasoned statistician will tell you that's less than 1. Whereas the plausibilities are also not normalized. So that degree of freedom has been introduced, and it's thought, therefore, that this is a better representation of the way that we truly do conceive beliefs. Withholding belief is not the same as attaching belief to another proposition, in other words. Well, I think I have well, this is one example. I'm going to spend too much time on this. This is a real-world example I was involved in, and this was looking at the reliability of an emergency shutdown system in a chemical facility. It looks a lot like the Newegg 1150 thing, only now we've got the failure rate on demand, that's one failure in 100 demands, plotted against the belief functions. So the top one, that's the plausibility. Bottom one is the support and belief. So what it's saying here, for instance, is that there is a 0.7 plausibility attached to the proposition that the failure rate is 1 in 100 or greater, and a 0.4 plausibility support function. This line down the middle, by the way, is the Bayesian line if you've done a Bayesian analysis, and it always happens to be the case that plausibilities and supports bound the probability, which is why often you see them referred to as upper and lower probabilities, which is really bad vernacular because they're not probabilities at all. Well, as you can imagine, this isn't a panacea by any means. I mean, it better represents perhaps the way we represent beliefs, but on the other hand, it has a big standardization problem. After all, what does a plausibility of 0.7 mean to someone? At least with Bayesianism, we've got the benchmark of frequentist arguments. If I say there's a 6th probability that some event's going to occur, at least I can mentally conceptualize the throw of a die, and the probability of one face coming up from a statistical viewpoint is a 6th. There's none of that benchmarking associated with Dempster-Schaeffer theory. I'm not going to go through this one, but another alternative to probability theory is possibility theory. Again, it's based in fuzzy sets. Fuzzy sets were developed in the 60s by Lotfi Zadia, and you probably heard of fuzzy sets. I wonder if he's the guy who designed this LCD projector too. I'm inclined to think he might be. They were developed in the 60s, and possibility theory is based in fuzzy sets. A similar type of concept. The advantage, it's more like the way we really conceive beliefs. Downside, how do you standardize these strange non-probabilistic measures? So, as you can imagine, folks they've not been quick to abandon probability theory as a way of doing uncertainty analysis, and Bayesian probability theory specifically. So the challenge has become ways of coming up with robust ways of producing probabilities that can represent uncertainties in an intuitive way. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I thought I'd mention, for this particular audience, I thought you might have some interest in a methodology that's based very much in the fundamental sciences. People like me with a background in physics like to think that all good ideas come from physics. And this is exactly the sort of thing that fuels that arrogance. So let me take you through this. This is the idea of entropy as uncertainty. Most of you are probably familiar with the concept of entropy in thermodynamic systems. Well, in the microscopic description of thermodynamic systems, in other words, in statistical mechanics, there's a very explicit relationship between entropy and probability. And this is the expression first developed by Boltzmann. K is the Boltzmann constant, S is the entropy of the gas, say. Pi is the probability that the gas is in any one particular state, a microstate. And by a microstate, it means a description of the position and momentum of every particle in the gas. It's a phase space description. So that's entropy on the micro level, relating it to probabilities. Well, in the 1940s, Claude Shannon, in his pioneering work in communications theory, imported this statistical notion of entropy. In his theory, it's a measure of the uncertainty associated with the information going through a communications channel. Incidentally, in thermodynamics, the uncertainty aspect is that entropy is a measure of uncertainty about which microstate a gas is in, given a knowledge of its macrostate. In other words, its energy and temperature and pressure and that kind of stuff. So there's an uncertainty thing there. Anyway, so Shannon imported this idea. There's a kind of a interesting story that Shannon was originally going to call his measure uncertainty, and apparently the great mathematician and quantum mechanic von Neumann persuaded him to call it entropy, because he argued that calling it that would always give him the upper hand in an argument, because no one would know what entropy was. And he followed von Neumann's advice, so it's entropy, it's not uncertainty. Then in the 1950s, Edwin James further imported this idea into what we would think of now as Bayesian probabilistic analysis. And his idea was, if you want to produce a probability distribution about an uncertain parameter, the way you would do it is you'd pull together whatever constraints you may have on that parameter, and then you formulate the probability distribution that maximizes the entropy. In other words, maximizes your uncertainty subject to whatever constraints are available. Right? So it's a very conservative way of not understating uncertainty when you produce a probability distribution. And it's a very practical method, it turns out. I've used this method on many occasions. I just thought I'd show you one example. This was a risk study I did for a client in the refining industry, and it was looking at the risk associated with forced outage of various refinery units. It looked like a classic reliability model in many ways, although in terms of the inputs, where the parameters were uncertain, we would use entropy maximization methods to come up with input distributions. We'd then propagate it through the model using a kind of Latin hypercube, which is a Monte Carlo variant, and it would produce output distributions over some of the key parameters, which these are examples. These are just showing the 5th and 95th percentiles of the distributions. But so this is saying there is a 95% Bayesian probability that the risk associated with forced outage of the crude distillation unit is $1.2 million per quarter or less, and a 95% probability that that risk is 200K per quarter or more. So it's a very useful methodology. It's not just a theoretical construct, and I think it's one of the most defensible ways about doing it and this sort of analysis. Well, I thought I'd just mention another method here. Obviously, one of the big challenges in probabilistic analysis is coming up with input distributions, because they have to be elicited from experts. And there's a whole industry about what's the best way to elicit information from experts. Do you have them in a room together? Do you have them kept apart? Do you have them write things down? Do you let them have feedback? It's, as I say, it's an industry. In the 1990s, a kind of interesting approach was devised at the University of Iowa. And it's, I wanted to mention it just because it's so closely related to that very fundamental definition of probability that I mentioned before in the context of betting on the bombers. In this method, it's based upon the idea that the financial markets tend to be very good predictors of events, or at least that's the theory. You often hear examples cited, so like, for instance, just before the first Gulf War, the price of crude gained very sharply, or another example people often talk about is the Challenger disaster. Even before the investigation report was out, somehow the marketplace had identified the company that manufactured the faulty part, and its stock took a nosedive. Kind of impressive little anecdotes like that. It's dumb agent theory. It's not a very complimentary way of looking at it, but the idea is that as traders, individual traders might not know a lot, but somehow when they're aggregated together in the marketplace, wisdom is produced. It's kind of the opposite of mob mentality. You get good stuff out of mobs as opposed to things getting worse. So in about 2003, DARPA, one of the DoD agencies, thought they'd explore this as a means of trying to predict political and terrorist events. The idea was there would be a limited participation futures market, maybe 1,000 people involved, and they would trade these futures contracts. And the notion is, just like the bombers example, that the trading price of a given futures would be a measure of the probability of some future event. So the futures were based around things like indices of economic and civil stability, say, in Middle Eastern countries, or sometimes the idea was it would be based around specific events. So they may be trading on the prospect of the assassination of a leader, a specific leader, or regime change, or a military coup, or some kind of political or military event. And they could thereby assess the probability of that. In fact, they put out a procurement for technical support on this. My small company actually bid on this and lost. But we took solace in the fact that we predicted that perfectly, and that's what actually happened. Anyway, as you can imagine, or maybe not, because they couldn't imagine it, the day it was announced, there was an uproar in Congress and in the media. It was denounced as being ghoulish and in horrible taste. After all, can you imagine the first person who goes to collect their winnings because someone was assassinated? I mean, it really was politically a very interesting thought process that must have led to this as a type of methodology. So what happened was, the very day after it was announced, it was cancelled. And I assure you there was no gloating in the hallways of my small company. It was cancelled for the reasons I said. And you know, there's even some, in hindsight, some legitimate technical questions about the validity of this too. You know, can you reasonably expect an efficient marketplace with only 1,000 traders of the futures? Or say that the marketplace indicated a high probability of some event that could adversely affect our national security? Well, clearly, you know, our government would take action, and traders must know that. So how that would certainly, you know, compromise the integrity of the futures trading prices as measures of probability. So overall, maybe in hindsight, setting aside the ghoulishness of it, it was not an ideal methodology. You may remember that Admiral John Poindexter, who headed up the department within DARPA, who put out this procurement. I mean, this led to a series of events in which he ultimately resigned. So, who said the world of uncertainty analytics is dull? This was quite interesting. Well, I don't want to give you the impression that the only front of research in uncertainty analysis is in the question of how do you devise metrics and how do you elicit experts and that sort of thing. That's not the case. There were some other areas, I think, of great relevance to what's going on at PNNL and of great relevance to our clients also. And in particular, there is the modeling of complex systems. It's interesting from an uncertainty perspective because where a system is complex, then so is the representation of uncertainty. So to an uncertainty analysis, a complex system is a very interesting challenge. Obviously, the reason that complex systems are of such growing interest is because many real-world systems have to be modeled by complex systems. I'm not going to go into what that's all about. I think Dave Chassin gave a very good talk in this series a few months ago. But suffice to say, with a complex system, you usually have many rudimentary components that are interacting with one another. And they may be doing that in just a simple way, but the sheer number and entanglement of those interactions means that it's not practical to try to model the system from a traditional analytic, top-down pen and paper approach. You have to resort to a bottom-up approach that generally involves, simulation methods and computer-based numerical simulation sorts of methods. So it's generally, it's the strategy of modeling the trees and the forests take care of themselves. That's what most complex system modeling is all about. So any systems that involve, for instance, human behavior, whether it be individuals, groups, societal, power grid dynamics, those sorts of things, climate, those are generally things where you have to resort to this types of complex system modeling. One particular methodology I think is of great interest and been used extensively here at the lab, and a particular interest from an uncertainty perspective is Bayesian network modeling. And that's particularly interesting because it very explicitly models that entanglement of uncertainties I was talking about. Just to give you a feel for what a Bayesian, many of you I'm sure have seen Bayesian networks before. This is part of a huge Bayesian network, but it was kind of so nicely represented I thought I'd just use it for this presentation. It's by Stitcher et al. It's only a couple of years old. Each box is a so-called node. And a node represents a series of alternative propositions or alternative event outcomes or whatever the ontology of the model dictates. The lines between the nodes are called arcs, and they represent a probabilistic dependence. So a box is probabilistically dependent upon an upstream box. In this particular model, they were trying to model the question of how a leader of a military regime might respond to a major regional strike. So some of the options in that big box in the middle is that he would make a run for it, he'd leave the country, he might resort to military force, he might try to negotiate, he might wait it out. I mean, those are the options. And then the boxes that lead into that show what factors might be relevant. You know, what is his command of the military? What are his real objectives? So in this way, you can kind of build from the bottom up a very complex representation of a system that you couldn't build from a top-down type of approach. There are lots of these being developed within PNNL right now. Allen Brothers, for example, I know has been developing medical diagnostic systems based on this sort of thing. We're also, Paul Whitney is developing models along similar lines, looking at radicalization of political groups for the Department of Homeland Security. And of course, as you can guess, where there are Bayesian nets, there are also Dempster-Schaeffer nets. Christian Parse and Antonio Sanfilippo have been generalizing this type of approach to look at Dempster-Schaeffer nets in the context of Department of Homeland Security motivation and intent type programs. So there's a lot of interesting applications of this very general reasoning, augmented reasoning type methodology. And I think there's a huge future. I think we're at the beginning tail of application of these types of methods. By the way, something else named for Bayes long after his demise. I don't think there's anyone who's, maybe Edison is the only competitor in terms of people who have had things unfairly named after them for a very long time. Let me just mention another program, and I want to mention this one because I'm involved in it. This is a kind of nexus of risk modeling and predictive modeling. What we're looking at here are future risks, risks to which we're not yet exposed. I'm doing this with Bob Fecht and Dick Weller, Heidi Mahy. And these are risks to which we're not exposed because the technology driving those risks is not yet fully emerged. We're looking in particular right now at synthetic biology. That's the ability to produce these pathogens by building up piece part genomic materials to kind of synthesize natural pathogens, or maybe in the further future create completely new life forms of pathogens, which would be a very unsettling possibility. So what this graph represents is, here's the timeline. This is the now, and then the dotted line is really representing the time at which a given technology starts to emerge and is being disseminated. The curved line here represents, as time goes on, the impediment to terrorist acquisition of this type of technology because of dissemination of information, etc. And the idea is that at some stage, obviously, we would want to put in place proliferation safeguards, and that represents this step here. But in the meantime, there is this risk exposure. And the sooner we can pre-identify what those threats are going to be, the sooner we can put in place the types of safeguards necessary to hopefully shorten the length of that line for the risk exposure. We're at very early stages in this right now, so in terms of methodology, but it's going to be based upon Bayesian type concepts and eliciting folks within PNNL at this stage at least who have the greatest knowledge of some of the substance of the technologies involved in synthetic biology. So I think this is a project particularly exciting because it brings together prediction and risk. Well, what's the future of uncertainty analysis and predictive analysis? Of course, I'm no Nostradamus, so I don't know the answer to that, but it's worth quoting, I think, Alan Kay, who, at the time he said this, he was a fellow with Hewlett-Packard, and he said the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And I think that in a way that's what's going on right now at PNNL. I think we've got some very exciting projects underway in predictive studies. One that's particularly exciting to me is one we're calling technosocial predictive analytics. This is basically trying to predict human behavior in the context of physical or natural infrastructures. So answering the question, where is a terrorist most likely to hit in terms of our national infrastructure? What is the response likely to be to climate change or some huge environmental upheaval? How might human factors affect the dynamics of power grids reliability and that sort of thing? And under the diligent leadership of Antonio Sanfilippo, what we are in the process of doing is looking at the gamut of very relevant capabilities here at the lab, some of them I think rather unique, and bringing those together to, I think, what we'll ultimately be doing is producing the next generation of human predictive, or as we're calling it, technosocial predictive models. So extremely exciting area to me, this. By the way, I tried to persuade Antonio to call this area Nostradamics, and he politely declined, and I predict he will not come to regret that. So I wanted to left about 10 minutes there for questions, so that's all my prepared material. If anyone has any questions on this by no means monographic slide, monochromatic slide that Antonio made, happily he's sitting here, so you might be able to help with that. So thank you.
So you used every prediction quote except my favorite one, which was by Niels Bohr, and he said, "Prediction is difficult, especially about the future." Anyway, do we have time for questions? Go ahead.
I got here a few minutes late, but since I've been here, I haven't heard the name Kolmogorov or any reference to his axioms. Where do they fit in here?
Kolmogorov?
Yes.
Well, very fundamental. I think that Kolmogorov was the fellow who really nailed down what a probability is. I mean, he came up with 3 axioms, essential, that define the way probabilities behave. So that's just the substrate to all of this. His work has been absolutely critical. And of course, he came long after Laplace. It always surprises me that it took so long for someone. Of course, it's always, in hindsight, right, it's always easy to understand these things. But Kolmogorov is the guy that makes probabilities what they are in the modern mathematical sense.
I guess the point of the question was, it would seem like both the frequentist and Bayesian approaches follow from the axioms,
well,
rather than there being a sort of insoluble division between the two.
Yeah, it brings out an interesting aspect of prediction and what it means. Given that Kolmogorov post-dated both schools of thought, I wonder if you can say that these outflow from Kolmogorov's theorems, but it's certainly the case that the mathematics governing whether it's the frequentist viewpoint or the Bayesian viewpoint is an identical set of maths. If someone writes equations down, you can't look at them and say, well, that's a frequentist interpretation or that's a Bayesian interpretation. Probabilities are a kind of pure essence that, depending upon your interpretation and your application, are equally applicable on both sides of the fence. I think it was not really, though, until the Bayesian approach emerged, people like Fanetti and Savage, Ramsey, was the idea put forward that these entities that satisfy Kolmogorov's theorems don't have to be frequencies, that degrees of belief can be modeled in this way. Of course, the Dempster-Schaeffer followers beg to differ, but that's what the Bayesians say. Yeah. Well, that's a good question. In classical, I think that one of the biggest differences from a technical perspective from classical versus Bayesian analysis is that with classical models, where you're kind of producing data probabilities from hypotheses, you can very much rely upon basic notions of statistical sampling, Poisson sampling, binomial sampling. And you can do your whole analysis, if it's doable, within that framework. It's the so-called likelihood function is the thing that tells you the relationship between the parameter you're interested in and the data. Now, in the classical approach, that likelihood function is the back-to-front probability I was talking about. In the Bayesian analysis, you use that exact same entity, but use it in a different way. In Bayesian analysis, you have a prior distribution, which is your kind of pre-data conception of degrees of belief. And you use that likelihood function then to update your prior to produce your so-called posterior distribution. So the price you pay for having it in that more convenient form of probability of proposition given data is that there's a very subjective a priori input to it, which is the prior distribution. And what you have to hope is that there's sufficient data that the likelihood part of it is the thing that's driving your posterior distribution and not your subjective kind of prior input distribution. So there are very close relationships between the two ways of looking at it. And I always feel that the difference is some way, it's more philosophical. It's certainly not a mathematical difference. But in a way, and two, Bayesians don't throw out the, baby with the bathwater. A Bayesian will still tell you there's a 50% probability that a tossed coin is going to land heads up. They don't come up with some other way of getting at that. But the way they'd put it is this. They'd say, yes, we know the frequency of it landing heads up is 50%. And although I don't think that is synonymous with saying the probability is 50%, I will adopt that as my personal probability. And that's an important distinction because it allows you to attach probabilities to things that don't have that stochastic dimension to them. So, I don't think these are very different ways of looking at the world in a sense. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There are right ways and wrong ways of doing it. There's nothing worse in terms of PR than putting a true philosophical Bayesian in front of the public, because a true philosophical Bayesian will tell you, along the lines of De Finetti, probabilities don't exist. It's a degree of belief, so it can't be wrong. How can you tell me my degree of belief is wrong? And that type of attitude in terms of what Bayesianism is all about. And of course that's a catastrophe, because if that were true of Bayesianism, and some people believe that. Some people believe that legitimate probabilities can be all over the map, even for people who are given exactly the same data. And maybe there's something to that, because in reality, none of us have exactly the same experiences, so we never truly have exactly the same data going into probabilities. But having said that, the situation is not that bad, because in reality, there are ways of producing these Bayesian probabilities based on data. And where you have conflict of opinion, there are ways of aggregating these disparate opinions to produce a reasonable overall assessment from the guy who believes one thing and the guy who believes the opposite thing. So you have to be very careful in how you convey these things. And of course the reality of it is it's the best you've got for decision making. The option is not, use some magical robust method that doesn't rely on Bayesianism. The option is not making a decision at all, or making the decision by the seat of your pants. That's the true option to doing it the Bayesian way.